So what do other countries know that we don't? What have they figured out that we haven't figured out? Or what have they been able to preserve intact that we, as a result of Reaganomics, and arguably the UK as a result of Thatcheronomics in 1980 and 1978 respectively, lost? Stephen Hill is on the line with us. He's the author of a brilliant new book, Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Insecure Age, out in paperback now. Also a recent article in The Nation, April 21st, 2010, Europe's Answer to Wall Street, which is basically an excerpt or an adaptation from the book. Stephen Hill, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Thom. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. You talk about practices in Europe, business practices in Europe, that are so different from what we have here in the United States that most Americans would not even recognize the names of things like co-determination, supervisory boards, and work councils. Actually, before we even get into this, in Germany, the second largest exporting country in the world, the fourth largest economy in the world. In Germany, what percentage of the corporations have their boards of directors elected by their workers? More than half of their boards of directors elected by the workers?
50% for the major corporations. So, and these are Fortune 500 companies like Volkswagen and Deutsche Telekom and others. The workers, by law, are elect 50% of the board members. It would be as if you could imagine, if we require by law for Walmart to allow its workers to elect 50% of its board members. Imagine the difference that would make in how Walmart treats its employees and even its supply chain. That's really the impact we're talking about here. And yet, most Americans, even progressives, have not heard about this at all.
And we're talking half of the major corporations in Germany.
No, all the major corporations you have this are required by law. But half of the boards of directors of all these major corporations are elected by the workers. And incidentally, this was put in place after World War II, in part by the United States and the conquering Allied powers, who wanted to break up the power of the German industrialists that had supported the Nazis. And I say in my book, we punished Germany by giving them economic democracy, and we've never seen fit to give it to Americans since then.
So one of the consequences in Germany, and other countries have adopted this as well, and you talk about other countries, some of them not as extensively. In Sweden, for example, it's about a third rather than half, but is it about a third of the directors, or is it a smaller percentage of the corporations?
No, it's all the corporations, but
all of the corporations.
All percentage, and different countries in Europe have a different percent of the board members that they allow the workers to elect. But in general, what it's created in Europe is what I call a culture of consultation, in which the workers and the employers and the business owners, they have to much more extensively confer with each other and figure out how they're going to move the business forward together, instead of just dictums from on high, layoffs by the millions as we've seen in the United States. This is part of the reason why in Germany they actually have not seen an increase in their unemployment during this economic crisis, even while it's more than doubled in the United States, because as a result of this culture of consultation, they decided to cut back everybody's work time a little bit. So instead, if you're working 100%, you went to 90%. Right. But during the good times, they put money aside. So if you're at 90%, you're still getting 95% of your pay, and that has prevented the utter devastation that we've seen in communities across the United States when the breadwinner is laid off and people lose their homes, houses go into foreclosure, increases in domestic violence, alcoholism, mental illness because of the devastation to communities and families. That's what we've seen in the United States, and they pretty much have avoided that in Germany and other places.
Well, and not only does it avoid all those economic or all those social ills, but economically, if working people are, even if they're working a little less, if they're still getting a paycheck, they're still consuming. And if they're still consuming, they're still producing demand. And if there's still demand in the economy, then there's a need to fit demand, which is business. And so the economy doesn't crash. It doesn't go into the downward spiral like we went into in the 30s and like we're in right now.
Exactly correct. And not only that, you keep your workforce intact, so when the recovery occurs, you're then ready to go as a business, whereas in the United States, millions of workers have been laid off, and they're just not in the mode now of being beginning, of working, and so you avoid that kind of thing as well. And yet, when Larry Summers, who is one of Barack Obama's closest economic advisors, was asked, why doesn't the Obama administration, why does the United States try some version of this short work, as it's called, that's worked so successfully in Germany, he said, that's not what we're about. We're not about protecting old jobs. We're about creating new jobs, as if there's a conflict between the two. And I think it really shows how Europe has been much more pragmatic in how they approach their style of capitalism, whereas here in the U.S. we're locked in a sort of fundamentalist view of our free market philosophy, even though that free market philosophy has reached a point where the government had to bail out the banks, and we've socialized the losses and privatized the gains, if you will. That's what.
Well, not just the banks. We also bailed out our largest automaker.
Exactly right. And so our free market philosophy doesn't even match up to our ideology, and yet we still insist that somehow we've got to follow that in a very fundamentalist way instead of being more pragmatic about helping people.
We're talking to Stephen Hill. He's the author of Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Industrial Age. A recent article in The Nation magazine, Europe's Answer to Wall Street, by Stephen Hill. And first of all, is the UK are they the outlier in Europe as a result of Thatcheronomics? This is certainly my sense of it, but I don't. You're the guy who actually did the research on a country-by-country basis.
Well, certainly there's differences within Europe from country to country, just as there are in the United States. California is certainly not like Mississippi. Oregon is not like Alabama.
Right.
And you see that in Europe as well. And so you could certainly say that in some ways the UK is more American-like in their approach, for example, as you mentioned, Thatcheronomics, which more boosted the financial industry, both as a percent of GDP as well as a percent of corporate profits, just as we did here in the United States. And as a result of that, Britain has been hurt quite a lot by the collapse of the financial industry.
Well, and plus one of the first things she did in '79 when she acquired the prime ministership was bust the largest union in the country, which is the coal workers union. And Ronald Reagan, one of the first things he did in '81 when he became president was to emulate that in busting PATCO as a way of declaring war on organized labor. And instead what's going on in Germany is that organized labor is actually embraced by both government and industry.
Yeah, but in subsequent years, I mean, especially in recent years, under the Blair government, under the Labor government, and Tony Blair was the longest-serving prime minister in post-World War II period, and they've taken a different tack that is much more Euro-oriented, and particularly in healthcare, for example. They have universal health care. They have some degree of works councils and co-determination in Britain compared to what we have here in the United States. They spend a lot more on child care, and their university education is higher than other places in Europe, but it's a lot less than it is here in the United States. So in many other ways, Britain is completely a part of the European family, much more than it is a part of the American transatlantic relationship. It's sort of betwixt and between in certain ways.
In the half minute or so we have left, Stephen Hill, author of Europe's Promise, the website europespromise.org, by the way. How do we wake Americans up to how this is happening? I mean, we haven't even had an opportunity to get into, and unfortunately we won't, things like co-ops. Louise and I were at Mondragon in Spain just a few months ago. But how do we wake Americans up?
Well, I think now's a good time because of the economic crisis and making Americans see that there are other development models. I mean, really what my book, Europe's Promise, is about is it's the story of post-World War II Europe and how it's transformed itself from a place of military warring nations that it had been for centuries to a place where it's a model for how a modern economy can develop itself and take care of its people and do it all in a way that's as environmentally sustainable as possible. Europe's ecological footprint is half that of the United States for the same standard of living. And so
absolutely. We need to learn from this. Stephen Hill, the book Europe's Promise, the website europespromise.org, and The Nation, Europe's Answer to Wall Street. Thank you, Stephen.